by keeping all the exports and imports from going in and out of the South. Now, why was that important? Prior to the war, 80% of the entire world's cotton production was produced in Antebellum South. Now, folks, that brought a lot of money into the southern states. If I could put it in comparison today, imagine a country in the world producing 80% of our entire oil production. What kind of mess we'd be in bigger, huh? But you have to understand this. Prior to that war, there was a population of 5.5 million people. And out of 5.5 million people, only 40,000 people owned slaves. So all that money was primarily benefiting just a small percentage of the population in the South. But it was a lot of money. Our government wanted some of it. Now, what do our government do even today when they want some of our money? They take it. We have to pay higher taxes. Well, our government was looking for a way to finance our progression west. In fact, if you were a Confederate prisoner, you were given, in most cases, one of two choices. You could stay in prison, or you could go out west and fight in the Indian War. And most, of course, went out west to fight in the Indian War. But our government placed high tariffs and taxes on all that cotton export, all that cotton production. Well, that upset a lot of the southern states. In history, there are three important factors that you must always look at when you study history. One is the economic situation.
Look at that dog.
The other is political, and I can add religion in there. And the other is human rights. And in any period in our history, what most of the time comes to the surface are the human rights issues, because in just about any war ever, we can always find some human rights atrocities in our history, in the history of the world. Well, before Georgia even seceded from the Union, Governor Brown of Georgia told the Confederates in Savannah to come down here and take this fort. 385 Confederates marched right through that sally port and took this fort without firing a shot. Now, how was that possible? Well, I got to back up just a little bit in the story. When this fort was completed in 1847, 14 years prior to the Civil War, like so many government projects, even today, when we got it finished, we didn't need it no more. We realized that invasion by the British, the Spanish, or French was not going to happen. And for 14 years, only two caretakers were in here looking after this brand new fortification. Folks, look around you. You are inside the stealth bomber technology of the Civil War. You could put over 140 cannons in this fort. Nobody could get close enough to do any damage, and everybody knew it. Both sides were convinced Fort Pulaski is invincible. When those 385 Confederates, all gunned up, loaded up, suited up, marched up to those two caretakers and said, "We're here to take this fort." Now, what do you think those two caretakers said? Duh. Here's your key. There wasn't no problem. But from January of 1861 to April of 1862, almost a year and a half, the Northern Army began to amass itself in this area. At Tybee Island, a mile and a half away, on Tybee over there, over 1,000 Northern troops came in. At Hilton Head Island, 5 miles by water in that direction, over 10,000 Northern troops came in. And there were only 385 Confederates in here. Now that don't sound right, does it? How in the world did 385 Confederates feel safe surrounded by so many thousands of Northern troops? It reminds me when I was a young boy. By the way, growing up in a mill town, my parents met in the cotton mill. I guess you could say I was a cotton mill baby. But there used to be, in the evenings when I was little, after supper, all us children were told to go to the front porch. And we'd go out there and we'd listen to stories by adults. It didn't matter to us whether they were true or not as children. It was just entertainment. It was our television back then. And we'd sit out there and we'd listen to all kinds of stories. They'd be talking about folks and what happened, and they'd be telling jokes and laughing and carrying on. Does anybody ever heard of Louis Grisard? I went to school with Louis Grisard in the same part of the country, in Georgia. I tell folks Louis used to copy my paper. Louis went on to make a career about Southern humor and things and stories, and I went to work for the Park Service. Well, there's this story. I remember that our parents told us, all us children, and we were so enthralled. But the story went like this. When Sherman got to Atlanta, Georgia, he took a left on I-20. He had heard about Stone Mountain and that laser show, and he wanted to go see it. So he takes all his troops out there, several thousand, and they get out there to Stone Mountain. And standing up on top of Stone Mountain was one lone Confederate soldier just yelling and harassing Sherman and all his men. Sherman turns to his officers and says, "We can't have this. Give me 10 brave soldiers." He sent 10 brave soldiers up there, but nobody came back. That one lone Confederate soldier still hooping and hollering and harassing Sherman. Sherman said, "Well, we can't have, this is embarrassing. All the news media here, they covering all this, CNN and everybody. Give me 150 brave soldiers." So we sent 150 brave soldiers up Stone Mountain. After a long while, way off in the distance, he saw them coming back. But something didn't look right. They were staggered. And when they got up to him, the man in the front just fell down on the ground and said, "Sir, it's an ambush. There's 2 of them." Yeah, I grew up hearing stories like that. So when I think about 385 Confederates in here, it don't surprise me. But then yeah, I grew up hearing stories like that. So when I think about 385 Confederates in here, it don't surprise me. But then again, looking at it historically, the North was convinced Fort Pulaski was invincible. 385 Confederates were even told by Robert E. Lee, who came here, they will not be able to do any damage to these walls from such a great distance. That's why 385 Confederates didn't care how many showed up out there. Nobody was going to get close enough to do any damage to the walls. Well, in April of 1862, the shot was fired and the battle started. In a 30-hour period, over 5,000 rounds of cannon fire, almost 200 rounds of cannon fire every single hour for 30 hours. Over 3 rounds of cannon fire every single minute for 30 hours. But nothing was taking down this fort. There was a brand new weapon called a rifle cannon that had never been tested in America before. We got that technology from Europe. But nobody knew what it was capable of. Some viewed it as nothing more than a pop. It didn't even shoot a cannonball. It shot a projectile only about 4 inches in diameter and about 17 inches long, but it went in a very straight line, bullseye accurate for 3 miles. One of the commanders on the northern side over there, a mile and a half away, requested a battery of those new cannons, about 8 of them. And for 30 hours, they pounded away at that corner right there. They were primarily concerned with knocking down as many brick into the moat as possible so that 1,000 northern troops could rush 385. That makes perfect good sense. Little did they know that every time that new rifle cannon projectile hit that 10-foot thick masonry wall, sometimes it would go in 2 feet. And after 30 hours, one of those projectiles peeped its face on this side And in that split second, history changed forever. There were no more forts built in the entire world. And we got out of the fort building. That projectile popped through this side, zoomed across this parade field to that corner down there. It bounced around, and down there is where the Confederates had stored 40,000 pounds of ammunition. Now, if that had blown up and killed everybody in here. Now, young Colonel Olmsted and his men had to make a big decision that day. If you've ever been in the Marines or are in the Marines, you know there's a question you may have had to ask yourself, and that question is, do I want to die on this hill today? Young Colonel Olmsted and his men made the decision. They didn't want to die on this hill that day, but rather they chose to surrender to fight another day. Now, what do I mean by that? It was early in the Civil War, and both sides weren't prepared to hold prisoners, so they just turned. They'd swap prisoners, sometimes right after a battle. Young Colonel Olmsted and his men, they got a free tour up to New York, and they was up there a few weeks, and then they just released them right back to Savannah. Now, what do you think those boys did when they got back down to Savannah? They didn't go on no tour. They didn't stand in line at no restaurant like Paula Dean. They went right back into the military. They lived to fight another day. But the latter part of that war was a different story. If you were a prisoner of war in the latter part of the Civil War, you were in the worst absolute position of any prisoner of war in history. You weren't issued any clothes except what you had on your back. There were soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg on both sides, had to march into that battle barefooted. They didn't even have shoes to wear. You weren't issued any comforts like bed linens or mattresses to sleep on. You slept right on the hard ground of the hardwood barns. The supply lines couldn't even get to the active duty military. They had to live off the land. And if you were a prisoner of war, you were fortunate to get any food at all. And then both sides did the unthinkable. They started using prisoners as human shields in battles. I don't care if you call it the Civil War, the war between the states, or the late unpleasantness. What we did to ourselves as a nation, no country has ever been able to do to us. Well, the slaves that made it here to Fort Pulaski had sanctuary after the battle that day. Some went on to South Carolina to form members of the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Northern Army, but it only lasted about a year and a half and they dissolved it. General Hunter, in charge of the forces at Hilton Head, he issued what was called Orders Number 7 in April of 1862, right after the battle, freeing all slaves at Coxpa Island and at Fort Pulaski.
Sorry,
Well, they rescinded that order. President Lincoln did. 2 years passed in that war before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by our government in January of 1862. When the Northern troops took over control of this fort, they established a naval blockade right out there in the Savannah River, stopping any ships getting to the port of Savannah. And one of the last ships that made it through there had thousands of these for the Confederate Army. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a British Enfield rifle, a .57 caliber weapon. It's very deadly. We have some reports that soldiers were killed up to 1 mile away with this weapon. This weapon is the primary reason why over 630,000 men died in that war. Well, I asked myself a question one day. Now, the British, they sold 1 million of these to both sides. I asked myself a question one day, now why in the world would the British sell a million to both sides, both the North and the South? They obviously didn't care who won. But then it dawned on me, we had not long been fought the British in the Revolutionary War. And they were hoping we'd do to ourselves what they didn't do to us. And it almost happened. Well, a soldier on a battlefield would stand elbow to elbow, touching. They believed in fighting in a straight line. Now, if we'd have thought just a little bit, we'd realize that's why the British lost the Revolutionary War. Because they marched in a straight line and wore what color? Red. Duh. And we hid behind trees and bushes. They didn't always know where we were, but we always knew where the British were. Well, soldiers on the battlefield, they didn't pay no attention, and that's the way they fought. They had the idea. Now, if I'm standing in line, say there's a soldier over here and a soldier over here, and say there's three of us touching elbows, what percentage target am I of the three? I'm 1/3. But if I'm standing over here by myself alone, and those other guys are standing over there, now what percentage target am I? 100%. And that's the way they thought. So they marched in a straight line, close. Don't break those lines. You've heard that in the movies. Well, that's the way they fought. Well, I'm going to step out here and go through a series of commands that they had to go through to fire this weapon. It's called loading in 9 times. Now, when I get to the command ready, you probably want to close your ears. Load 9 times. Load. Handle cartridge. Now I'm reaching back in this pouch and I'm pulling out what would have been wrapped together, the projectile and the gunpowder. It would have all went in at one time. Now there's no projectile in it. Tear cartridge. Charge cartridge. Now if you notice I'm buttoning it on the ground, trying to drive that gunpowder all the way down. Draw rammer. And if you folks would hurry up, thank you, Jim. Charge cartridge. Return rammer. Prime. Now I'm putting a metal cap on this cone, and when the hammer strikes it, it's going to cause a little explosion that's going to travel through the end of the barrel and ignite the gunpowder. Ready! Aim! Fire! Cease fire! Now that was pretty loud just for one. That was pretty loud just for one rifle. Imagine thousands of them on the battlefield going off at one time. After the Battle of Gettysburg, over 27,000 of these rifles were found. Out of the 27,000 found, over 17,000 of them were still loaded. Out of the 17,000 still loaded, over 12,000 of them were loaded 2 or more times. And one rifle was found loaded 21 times, where a soldier kept loading and pulling the trigger, not realizing he was having a misfire, because you couldn't tell on the noise on the battlefield. He couldn't tell the percussion from the other rifles. He just thought his was going off all the time, but it wasn't. Well, a soldier was required to fire this weapon 3 times in 1 minute. Now, somebody time it this time, and let's see how long it takes me to get off the ground. Load in 9 times. Load. Commence firing. Now, this is where they wouldn't call out the commands. They just told them to fire at will. Whoever he was. Now you're hoping that the soldier on the other side over there is going through the same process as you are, but I got a feeling I'm done dead by then. Ceasefire. How long did that take?
30 seconds.
Huh?
30 seconds.
Oh, I got no
You'd
chance.
only get two in.
I got no chance. 30 seconds. Oh, my goodness gracious.
What time would they do it in normally?
Normally 3 times 1 minute, about once every 20 seconds. Well, as you can see, you're talking to a ghost. People ask us all the time, are there ghosts out here? I guess I'm one of them. I'd like to take a moment in closing to pay a special tribute to all those that died during that war. Over 630,000 men died. More men died during that war than all the wars that we in America have faced combined. At the Battle of Appomattox, over 23,000 died in that battle, and it was a draw. No one was declared the winner. And 9 times of the people that died that day than what died at Normandy. We had a problem in this country, and we didn't know what to do. I want to share with you this account that happened on December the 13th, 1862, at Marie's Heights in Virginia, better known as Fredericksburg. By the end of the first day of the battle, over 12,000 Northern troops lay dead or dying on the slopes of Marie's Heights in Virginia. And as night fell and fog blanketed that site, you could hear the cries and the moans of pain and thirst in great numbers. The very next morning, a young rebel sergeant, 19 years old, by the name of Richard Roland Kirkland, went to see his commander, General J.B. Kershaw, and he said to him, "General, I can't stand this." "What's the matter?" asked the general. "Sir, all day and all night I've heard those poor men crying for water out there, and I came to ask permission to take them water." The general was taken back, but then said to him, "Kirkland, son, don't you realize the moment you climb over that wall, you're going to get a bullet through your head?" He said, "Yes, I thought about that, but if you let me, I'm willing to try." The general thought and then finally said to him, "Kirkland, I ought not to allow you to run such a risk, but the sentiment which actuates you is so very noble, I will not refuse your request." Young Kirkland then ran down the stairs where he collected some dozen or more canteens of water, and then he climbed over the wall. At first, the Northern troops thought he was trying to rob the dead and the wounded, and they started firing. But soon, however, his true motives were discovered. Then thousands of men on both sides stood up, and for over 1 hour and a half, they applauded and cheered as young Kirkland brought relief to those dying soldiers. There's a statue today in young Kirkland's honor at Marie's Heights in Virginia, and he became known as the Angel of Mercy. The Civil War was a defining point of our nation's history. It was the very first test of our young nation's Constitution, but it established forever liberty and freedom for everyone. What we did to those people by bringing them over here as slaves in our country was wrong, and we as a nation paid a high price. We may argue, we may fuss, we may disagree about a lot of things, but may we never ever reach a point again in our country's history that we're willing to take arms and kill ourselves and let any country know or any people know whether they wish America good or whether they wish America ill. We all cherish our liberty and our freedom. And thank God Almighty, we are the United States of America.
Hoorah!